Obviously, I like to fancy myself a shrewd negotiator and a good car buyer, and I've found some amazing cars and gotten some really, really good deals. But of all the cars I've bought, I think the two that are the best deals were the Iranian terrorist drug dealer Mercy that I ended up kind of flipping my way into getting it for free, and the Roof RT12S. Roof gets most of its reputation from Gran Turismo games because Porsche didn't license the likeness to those games, and so Roof was the representation of Porsche in the games we grew up playing. And they obviously have the legends of the Yellowbird and the Nürburgring sliding around videos that are all amazing. But Roof is a phenomenal brand, and they're known for insanely fast cars. And I had always been fascinated by them, and in 2012, I stumbled upon a 2006 Roof RT12S that was at Lamborghini Palm Beach. And I've told a story about the car before, but to quickly recap, the car was involved in a multi-year lawsuit because the general manager of the dealership didn't know what it was. And he numbered it on trade like it was just a slightly modified Porsche 911. Now, in fact, it was a W09 VIN, meaning it was a VIN from Pfaffenhausen, from Roof, not a WP0 VIN like a Porsche would have been. And so the general manager before that guy had guaranteed a trade allowance that this general manager thought was insane. It was like $130,000. And so he refused to honor that pre-agreed trade allowance on an incoming Aventador, sold the Aventador to somebody else on the waiting list, lawsuit happens, and the car's tied up in it for years. It's a matte black car with a brown interior, red mirrors, badly painted wheels, and it just sat outside in Southern Florida for years. I knew the general manager of the store well. I had mentioned to him several times that if you ever do get through this lawsuit and you want to sell this car, I know you don't want it. I'd kind of like to play around with something like that, make a little bit of money on me, sell me the car. And he'd agreed to, but as the lawsuit went on, he had moved to a different dealership. The next guy didn't really care. It was not really his problem. And so I figured I'd lost the car. I left Lamborghini Atlanta, where I'd been working since 2009, late in 2015. And on Christmas Eve, I was for some reason browsing Auto Tempest, and I stumbled upon a Craigslist posting from upstate New York. And it was for a Roof. Didn't say a model, but it did say that it was black with a brown interior, and literally the only picture was the gauges, which are lit in green on Roof cars. Pretty unique. And I knew that there was only one matte black over brown Roof car in the US, and it was this car. And the broker didn't have a price, and he didn't know much about the car. I told him what I knew about the car, and all the things that I knew would have been kind of like the cons, that it's set outside, that it hasn't been running, that nobody's been servicing this car, and that it's been tied up in a lawsuit and had this stigma. So I get him to take the post down. I say, look, I will write you a check for the car, even though I had almost no money, and I was certainly bleeding through it very quickly at that point. But over the next couple of days, we do come to a deal, and I agree to buy the car for $78,000. Now, this car was about $300,000 new, supposedly had 730 horsepower, the integrated roll cage, the narrow body, small mirrors, tall gearing, everything you want. Rear-wheel drive, manual transmission, like the quintessential spec for a 997 generation Roof. Now, the RT12s and RT12Ss used the 996 motor. They still liked that. The 997 turbo engine had variable vane turbos. It was harder to modify, more sensitive engine management, just not the car they wanted to work on. They didn't go with that engine until the RT12R. And so, as best I could tell, there were only 6 or 7 RT12s and RT12Ss in the United States. And so phenomenally rare cars that nobody really knew anything about. And at that point, there was not a dealership for Roof in the United States. There had been one in Dallas. There was now one being started in Canada, but they didn't have any cars. And so there really wasn't anybody who knew how to service the car. I picked the car up in Miami, road tripped it home with my younger brother, and just sort of dove into it, trying to figure out who could work on it, who knew anything about it. I knew some of the guys at Goldcrest Porsche. They're phenomenal Porsche race mechanics. They went through the car a little bit. They said, wow, this thing is pretty unique. It's got a really tight rear diff. They're like, be careful in the rain. They couldn't make it run exactly right. Immediately, it was clear the car was not making 730 horsepower, and it was never going to get anywhere near its 228 mile an hour claimed top speed. And so it was a little bit of a letdown in that regard, but also it had a Moton hydraulic suspension. It was not stable at all if you were going straight. Once you started to steer, the steering rack and the differential just locked it into wherever you wanted to point it. But if you wanted to go straight, especially if you wanted to go straight and fast, it would get a mind of its own. It would just jump around lanes. Horrifying. And so for this car that was like on paper the greatest thing ever built, to be such a letdown driving was really, really hard. And I had no money. I was not making any money. VINwiki was still barely even an idea amongst me and some of my friends. And so I didn't know what was next in my life. I just knew that I'd found a really good deal in it, and I would probably have to sell it before too terribly long. And honestly, I wasn't too upset by that. It was one of those heroes that you met and you really didn't like that much. Now, there weren't any for sale in the US. There was one for sale in Germany. I actually listed it on a German classified site to see if I could find a buyer over there. Figured, maybe it's worth more to people who understand what it is. Didn't really get anywhere, but I ended up selling it to the guy who used to run the roof dealership in Dallas, and he was brokering some cars, and so I sold it to him for $154,000, and so just about doubled my money. On a percentage basis, it was the best flip I ever had. And so I've made more dollars on cars, but they were on more expensive cars. And so I was excited. It was a great win. And literally in the 2 years, almost to the day, from when I departed Lamborghini Atlanta until I made my first, $100 AdSense check from YouTube, that was the only money that I made. And so I had to sell it. I was happy with the number, and then I was happier once I learned that after they bought it, they spent about $50,000 making the engine run right and sorting out the suspension. It sold, they had asked $199 for it, so they didn't make much money, or they probably lost a little bit of money. And then they listed again about a year later, same price. And so it was interesting that the car was being sold a lot, and it popped up about 6 months ago. And so obviously it's a distinctive car, and it had been changed a little bit. They'd added some houndstooth to the centers of the seats. It looked very, very clean. They'd put the wheels back to silver, painted the calipers and stuff like that. And so the car also claimed to have had some more money spent in more reconditioning. Then I see that it's popped up as a pre-sale listing for the upcoming RM Amelia Island auction. I'm like, well, that's going to be pretty fascinating. We'll see what the market shall bear. At that very moment, I saw that there was another one for sale on Bring a Trailer, and their very, very aggressive Facebook ad marketing. If you've looked at one thing and they have anything similar, it'll pop up. And so it said, oh, you might like this white roof RT12. So not an S. So theoretically it would have 685 horsepower, but I go over the listing. And in fact, it was a California emissions compliant version, which that was my biggest struggle with the car, because when I took the car to get a Georgia emissions inspection, which really only involves, is the check engine light on? There's no reading, there's no data, there's no readiness monitors, there's nothing. So it doesn't pass, and I contact the factory, and they're generally available to help, and they said, well, which port did they use? I said, well, I wasn't aware that it was lawful to have more than one OBD port. And they said, oh no, yeah, the one they were checking was the 997 one that just ran the body. In fact, there's an engine one on the other side, as though the car were a right-hand drive car. You have to remove a panel around the glove box, and that's how you access it. And so, great. I go back, and it still fails. And so we end up having to ship the ECUs to Bosch right around the Dieselgate time, and they make it pass. Apparently, in order to make the cars fully California emissions compliant, you had to cut the power down to 530 horsepower. So while this was everything that my car was except for the power, it's a nice looking car. White's a good Porsche color. A roof is actually known for getting body in white cars. That's what they call them. They get these kind of basic chassis from Porsche, and then obviously they build them and customize them into whatever they are. And so I was curious to see what this car was going to do on Bring a Trailer. It had like 8 or 9 days left, and it was at 250, which was a strong number, right? But the whole market's obviously strong right now. And so I watch it every once in a while just to see, and it doesn't really move. But a couple of nights ago, Doug Tabbitt called me, and he was asking me some question, and I was not just bored from Doug Tabbitt talking, but I was browsing around the internet, and I clicked on where I'd bookmarked that, and I go, holy cow, Doug, go to Bring a Trailer. And he's like, what? I said, were you watching that RT12? And he said, no. And then the deafening silence on the phone. I mean, because I think I'd already said, like, Doug, guess what it brought, and then double it, and you're still not going to be close. The darn car sold for $910,000. Now, again, I made a lot of money on cars, and I've sold some cars that are now worth a lot more than when I sold them, but in many cases, they're manual Mercies that I have another one, and so I'm not that worried about it. The whole market's moving in tandem. Maybe my 360 Spider from the rental car company that was a stick is worth more, but not a ton more. It was still a rough rental car. And so I feel like I've gotten the better of most of these deals, but not that one. I mean, I sold a car for $154,000 that is nicer by every standard and certainly equipped better than this one. 910 grand? I didn't know what to say. Additionally, we're about to do Card Trick 7, which will end at the Amelia Island Concours, where Freddie, Tyler, and myself will be judging our class and stuff like that. And so I'm gonna watch my car sell based on that market precedent for, I would have to imagine, over $1 million. And just grin and bear it, I suppose. But that is how things happen. Maybe it's a $700,000 mistake that I have somehow made. But, you know, if I'm honest, if it hadn't been for the profit made on that car at the time the profit was made, I would have needed to go get a regular job sooner rather than later, and it certainly would have precluded me from taking the time to explore the concept of a YouTube channel. And so much better things have come because of that transaction, and I didn't even like the car. I like my Scud much better as an additional car next to a Mercy, but what have we learned? The best car to have next to a Mercy is more Mercies. And so I don't miss the car at all, but I apparently missed out on quite the profitable win. So we'll see how badly I've messed up come a few weeks at Amelia, but for now, I'm happy with what's in the garage. We'd like to thank Patrick Adair Designs for their support of the VINwiki channel this month. Patrick and his team create some of the most amazing rings you've ever seen out of the most interesting materials on Earth, and I guess from space at times, because they do also use meteorites and superconductors and all this crazy stuff, interesting metals, even at times parts from broken exotic cars. This one was made out of some carbon fiber and some aluminum from the barrel of a broken LP640 wheel off a car I used to own. This year we're going to do some more exotic car part collaborations with different ring ideas, so be sure to stay tuned for that. You've also seen Patrick sitting right here in this chair telling some of his best car stories, and he'll be back to tell some more. Patrick has also documented his journey of entrepreneurism and some of their ring projects on his own YouTube channel, as well as some of his amazing car projects. So check them out and visit them at the link in the description below. Use the code VINwiki20 for a 20% discount, and thank them for their support of VINwiki.